Chapter 5, A Place in the Wilderness. From Rutland to Salisbury was 13 miles, as the crow would fly, but Otter Creek meandered through the valley like a long snake. It seldom followed a straight course for more than a few hundred yards. After getting out of sight of Rutland, Amos and Solomon had many a good laugh at the clever horse trader and his trick of trading the canoe without paddles. Though the paddles they had fashioned left much to be desired, they kept the canoe on its course and helped the current enough to move them north several miles a day. Toward evening of the first day out of Rutland, they were gliding along quietly and smoothly when Solomon whispered to his father, "Look ahead." There at the creek bank drinking was a beautiful buck with antlers spread out over the water. Quickly Amos had his musket in hand, taking aim, pulled the trigger. His accurate shot hit the deer from behind the shoulder, and he lurched along headlong into the water. We feast for a couple of days, shouted Solomon as they paddled toward the deer, which had even then ceased to struggle in the water. They pulled the canoe ashore and dragged the deer from the water. Amos showed Solomon how to proceed with dressing the meat. The hide was stripped, scraped, and rolled for churning when they had the time to work with it. The liver was removed for a nourishing liver stew and would be their supper. The hatches of venison were carefully cut and wrapped in birch bark for use the next day or two. The rest of the carcass that could not be used was left by the creek bank for other hungry creatures to find. Amos and Solomon, with their supply of fresh meat, were soon on their way again. Amos said it was not a good idea to camp too close to the place where they had dressed the animal, for other forest animals would be hovering around. Camping at night from the canoe was quite different from camping with a pack horse. Arrangements had to be made to secure the canoe and its contents. They could not go far from the water's edge, lest the animals raid their food supply in the canoe. So they tried each night to camp at or near a clearing where a settler had already staked out his claim. In this way they had companionship and shared information. The first night they stopped near Pittsford, a shallow place in the creek where a horse could wade across. Silas Pitney from Litchfield, Connecticut, had a place here. He was more than hospitable, and Amos gave him a large piece of venison in return for permission to camp near his cabin for the night. All the rest of the food Amos placed in the large kettle and pulled it up over a tree limb till it was safely out of reach of any prowlers. Silas Pitney told about choosing his place. He had traveled further north, but he did not like being far from other people, and so had staked his claim near the ford, or he knew more people would be traveling that way. He knew about the 3 towns that John Everts had charted. The northern town was called New Haven. After the big town in southern Connecticut, the southern town was called Salisbury, for most of the guarantees came from Salisbury, Connecticut. He didn't know what to call the town in between, so temporarily he called it Middlebury. Silas had looked at land in those towns, but it was too far north for him. But it is some of the most beautiful land I ever saw, he added. The creek is wide and deep up there, and the valley has rich bottom land that goes back miles from the creek in either direction. This sounded like the kind of land Amos was looking for. So he asked, "How is the south boundary of John Everett's grants marked?" "Oh, that's easy," said Silas. "I was up that way when Everett's was making the survey. You go about 2 days canoe trip from there. Here. Then you come to a place where Otter Creek turns sharp west. At the spot, another creek. At that spot, another creek comes in from the east. So big you can't tell it's from the Otter unless you notice which way the water's flowing. Right there, where the creek turns west, is south boundary of John Everett's 3 towns. The north boundary is about where the creek goes into Lake Champlain, and prettier country you'll ever see anywhere." He paused a while, then added, "Sometimes I think I made a mistake in not staying there. The land is better than here. I guess I didn't have the heart for being so far north. Now I can get to Rutland in a day. Someday, maybe, but then I'll probably be too old." The picture that Silas Penny painted of the land to the north stirred Amos and Solomon so that they were off bright and early the next morning. By noon of the second day, they came to the place where a large tributary entered Otter Creek, and the main stream turned sharply west. Here, then, was the land they had traveled so far to see, and somehow along these banks was a 100-acre plot just waiting for them to claim. How different they now felt. They were not hurrying to get somewhere far off. They were there. Here was their land for the taking. They glided along the current, looking first on one side of the stream and then on the other. And this way they traveled for 2 miles. Before the creek made another sharp turn toward the north, the timber was heavy and came to the edge of the creek. In most places, the creek bank was sharp dropped of 4 or 5 feet to water level. In the spring, the water probably rose over the banks, but now, after a long summer, the water was well below the level of the land. During the 2 miles they had traveled, they had not found one place where they could draw the canoe ashore. But now they began looking for a place where they might spend the night. They had moved out well beyond the outposts of civilization as they had known it. Not a human being was within miles of them, they were quite sure. Paddling along slowly and quietly, Amos peered ahead. He pointed to a small inlet on the east bank of the creek. "Let's pull in there and look around," he said. This they did and set foot in Salisbury, Vermont. For the first time in their lives, here they were to know joys and sorrows. Here they would add an important chapter to the life of the state. Pulling the canoe in close to the overhanging bank, Amos made it secure. Together they walked off into the woods to get the lay of land. It was quite some distance before the land began to rise above the level of the creek. The trees were massive and straight and quite far apart. "This is beautiful timber," said Amos. "If we had a sawmill, it would be just right. But this was too big for us to use in a log house. We will need small trees about 10 inches to a foot across. Let's spend the night here and then look farther on tomorrow." The next morning they set out for a further exploration. 2 or 3 times they put ashore at likely-looking spots, but each time they returned to their canoe. In some places the trees were too big, or not the right kind, or there was not enough variety. At other places the land did not rise enough from the creek bank to be sure of safety from spring freshets. Although they found many marshy spots, they did not find any really good springs. 2 or 3 miles upstream from the place where it turned sharply north, they noticed a bend in the creek with a small inlet that looked right for getting the canoe ashore. The land rose gently to the east with a small plateau that could be through the trees. The trees were large and free from underbrush. Here they stopped for more exploration. Amos went toward the low plateau. Here he stopped by a small patch of ferns and felt the ground. It was wet. He was sure there was a spring just below the surface. On the plateau, the trees were more numerous and not so large. This probably meant that the table of rock was underneath. Although it could not grow such large trees, it would be a good place to build a house, because the frost would not go so deep, and frost damage to the house would not be so great. Amos called to Solomon, who had been exploring north along the creek bank. How do you think the site would be for a cabin site? How do you think this would be for a cabin site? Solomon knew his father liked the spot, and he agreed. The creek was just out of sight, about 200 yards away. The land was well above the level of spring floods. The trees were numerous and the right size. The low-lying land would be fertile for cultivation and cleared. It looks like just the spot, Solomon said. But is there a spring nearby? How about that place where the ferns are? His father suggested. Solomon ran to the spot and began to dig with his hands. He pulled away the ferns and some of the flat stones underneath. The holes that the rocks began slowly to fill up with muddy water. Looks like plenty of water here. If we can find the exact place, we'll have to work on that later. For now, we can get all the water we need from the creek, Amos said. Is this the place, Father? Solomon asked. I think it is, son, Amos answered, so quietly without ceremony, a homestead that was to become famous in the life of Vermont was chosen. Let's build a shelter here and move our supplies up. Then we can get to work, Amos said. And the first axe blade dug into the hardwood with a sound that rang through the forest in all directions. Solomon didn't say anything to his father about it, but he thought to himself, what if Zeke, Jenny, and some Indians should hear the sound of the axe and come to find out who was settling here? But he put the thought out of his mind and went to work.